Hi everyone, welcome to episode 2 of the Blackline Coaching Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about that classic question, are bigger gears faster? We found this one really interesting. And as always, if you want to reach out, get in touch, ask questions and continue the chat, then hopefully we can help you with your own training to make you faster. But as I said, a lot covered in this one, so enjoy.
Simple question, Hayden. Are bigger gears faster?
Simple answer, no. I think a lot of riders have the perception that bigger gears are faster. They see the pros riding big gears and they think, that's what I need to be on. But essentially, everyone's going to have their own fastest gear, depends on the effort they're doing. And you've got to sort of stay open-minded to it. I think you've got to change the way you think about gears. A gear ratio is a way of reaching a cadence range that you want to. So I think if we're talking how to find the fastest gear for a rider, the best way to do that is to find the cadence that they're probably most powerful at, the speed that they think they'll be hitting, and then work back from there to find a gear ratio to suit.
And I find this really interesting because when you say that, then would you, because my take on it would be more likely to try lots of different gears, make sure that you're exposed to different cadence ranges in training so you can execute on those gears and kind of give your body like a fair chance to respond to find the cadence range it works well at, and then get on track and try it and see what's fastest. I think a lot of people do try and figure out what their optimal cadence is. Like, would you try that? So a really common thing I hear is SRM testing. I hit the best, or any power testing, I hit the best power numbers when I average 120 RPM. Therefore, absolutely 120 RPM is my cadence range, and I'm going to find that gear. Do you think you can be that specific with power testing? Or?
Absolutely not. I think if you're doing that sort of thing with the power testing and then finding the cadence is probably a good way to find a good start point. Certainly better than saying, Harry Racing qualifies on this gear, I'm going to ride that gear. But ultimately, I think real-world track testing is the most specific way of testing anything because it's exactly how you're going to race on it. So I think, the testing on track, trying out the different gears, ultimately is probably the best way to find what gear is going to be quickest for you. But if you're looking for a start point, because there's such a broad range of gears that will work for different riders, working out your most powerful cadence and then going from there is probably quite a good way to go about it.
Then powerful cadence over 5 seconds are going to be different to your most powerful cadence over 30 seconds as well. I think it's like a balance. I think what Hayden says is really true is like, I think guys get in their head a certain gear that they want to use. I want to use 130. That's completely irrelevant. If you're riding outdoors, 130 is a lot bigger than it would be if you're on Aguas Calientes, for example. Like your cadence is going to be so much higher indoors altitude. So the cadence is only one part of the puzzle. The gear is only one part of the puzzle. It ultimately comes down to your cadence and which cadence you're most efficient on, which cadence you can hit the best peak on, and which cadence you can hold on to the entirety of whatever that effort is. So I think really stressing to riders that finding a gear that works in certain scenarios is best. So you may have a gear that you use on an outdoor windy track, you may have a gear that you use when you're riding on a 250 indoor on the wood. Looking at that, then trying to normalize the cadence rather than normalizing your gear is probably the best way to finding consistency in your effort.
I think another point that's often overlooked is when you are doing cadence testing to find the cadence that you're most powerful at, people will often do sort of a 5 or 6 second sprint and like pick a moment in time where they're most powerful, and then apply it to a flying 200 without thinking about the 30 seconds building up, where you'll be doing probably between 20 and 80% of your max power for 30 seconds. Like, it's going to take a bit out of you. They neglect that when they're selecting gears. It's a very different effort to a 6 second sprint. I think you've got to keep everything like that in mind, and it's all relative.
I say that sort of testing at a certain cadence probably good for like monitoring progress, but there's no sprint really where you're at the same cadence for the entirety of the sprint. It just doesn't really exist. 200 is probably the closest you get to it. But if you look at a standing lap, you start at 0 RPM, you end at 150. Kilo, you start at 0, you end at 0 is a last lap. You may end pretty low, but it's going to be way above 100. Every sprint event, you go through a range of cadences. So I think it's important to be strong across a range of cadences, which is why you do under gear training and over gear training. but looking at your specific power on a certain gear is valuable in terms of probably monitoring and performance tracking. But I think in terms of deciding your 200-meter gear based on 6-second power test at a certain cadence is kind of redundant, because it ignores what goes into before the effort and after the effort, as in the end of the effort. I think the best way of finding your gear is testing a range of cadences across the same effort over a number of sessions.
Yeah, I think the key point is you've got to keep everything in context. I think a lot of track cyclists find a bit of data and really sort of hone in on it, like, this is my cadence or this is my gear. You've got to keep an open mind, keep everything in context, and just relate everything back to ultimately you're trying to find the gear that's going to make you go fastest in a race. Stay open-minded to that. Use the data to help you, but don't get too fixated on it.
Yeah, and just like to, in terms of it being about cadence, I think that works as a concept, but, just to, almost put the other end of the kind of arguments, on my track bike, I don't have cadence and I don't have power. So I keep an eye on what my cadence would be, because I look at my time and I work out what the average is. So I know roughly. I train with a watt bike at home, so I have access to some power for some of the benefits of training with power. But my gear selection is based on time, in terms of the actual event itself. So how do I work out what gear I'm going to qualify on? I try a range of gears and see what's fastest, and then I can plan my training around that, and I can figure out how fast I'm pedaling from the time. So I have a very a time focused approach. It's not just to always try and get faster, but I use that information to figure out other bits as well. And I think for me, it comes down to there's no one measure or metric in cycling which is absolute. You have to look at power, you have to look at your line on track, you have to look at time, because everything has its failings, but together with kind of taking into account everything, you can get quite a complete picture. So if you only focus on power, you're missing, the nuances of riding the track. You're missing your line. If you look at your time, obviously that's impacted by conditions, as well as the shape of the effort, the execution. There's a skill involved. And whilst people can be pretty similar, to absolutely be bang on throughout the fatigue of a session, for example, is quite challenging. So for me, I always think of it as, take all of the information, which is kind of your cadence, your speed, your time, your power, and then use it together to make a decision. As opposed to saying, I'm jumping on for power testing, my best 30-second powers at 120 RPM, case closed. That's my cadence for life. Get it tattooed on your arm. But I do think people have that mindset that they really obsess over one metric and they ignore all the others. So yeah, that's kind of my bit on it. It's
power's not related to speed really. Anyway, you can hit higher power on a P1 gear over 6 seconds than you could on a 200 gear, but you're going to go a lot quicker on that 200. I think you're right. It's just the part of the puzzle. But I think the principle of looking at cadence over gears should stand, because that's one thing you can keep constant between tracks, between conditions. Whereas, gearing can really relative depending on where you are.
And I was just to go back to SunDrive, because I think it's so important that we capture. We've all got, we all train indoors. We train regularly indoors. We have this relatively stable environment, But on a different day, how much quicker do you think SunDrive is compared to a pinging day in July with no wind and 28 degrees? Which obviously is most of the year, and a slow day.
You can be on the same track and go 2-3 tenths faster within a week. Actually, you could, and your gear selection could change by where the headwind is or the tailwind. But I think some people see themselves as big gear riders, and it's like a reputation, or it's like an egotistical thing. Sometimes it's a bit of macho, and don't take into account all of the sort of aspects that we're talking about, and maybe they will always see those numbers as better on the big gear because they see themselves as a big gear rider. And I think now more than ever, there's almost peer pressure, because people look around, they see big chain rings, and maybe don't realize that they're not big gears. They're looking at big chain rings, and
With a big sprocket at the back.
big huge sprocket on the back. It's the first thing. So I was training last night. And I had warm up gear on. I had a 94 or something like that to do a jump. And there was a 62 on the bike, and somebody was like, "Whoa, what a huge gear!" And it's the first thing you see, right, when you look at the bike. So yeah, some people don't realize that you're not looking at a big gear rider and not riding huge gears. They're actually just riding a normal gear with a bigger ratio. It's important to also not worry about what other people are riding. I think find the gear that's right for you.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting concept shift that not everyone, but many people would have. And most people think if I put on a bigger gear, then I will go faster. But actually, you need to hit more power or go faster and then put on a bigger gear. So you can't chase speed by chasing the gear. Like that's actually fundamentally the wrong way around. You need to work out how to be faster and then gear up to keep that cadence the same, right? Yeah, sure, with training and time and throughout your training life, your optimum cadence may change. That's partly going to be based on the training you're doing, right? So if you have a very P1 focus, you're doing a standing lap on 100-inch gear or whatever, then you're probably going to be relatively high on the cadence range because of your training. Whereas if you focus on keirin solely, then you'll probably be a slightly lower cadence rider. But I think
Sorry, go.
I just think that's a real fundamental concept: is go faster, gear up, as opposed to gear up so I will go faster, because there's no guarantees.
I think there's an age thing in it as well, because physiologically, as you're getting older, your rate of firing is going to be slower. So, I think it does make sense to then gear up in some respect, but I think you still need to have that strength and that power to get that gear going. I think there's a lot of different reasons why people may use bigger gears over smaller gears. But as you say, I think it's important to take in the whole piece of why you're using a bigger gear, rather than just saying you bigger gear because that's what the pros use.
Yeah, and you are right, because I think so. We work with riders from 17 through to, or younger, through to mid 70s, right? And the older you are, the lower the cadence range. But I think that declines at something like 5 RPM every 10 years. So by the time you get 50 years down the road, yeah, the change there is significant. But I think when you're late 30s, or 40s, for example, and you feel like you're kind of an aging athlete, I'm very aware, and then you feel like, okay, well, I need to gear up massively because I'm now old. And actually, that probably means a couple of teeth. It's not, it's 2-4 inches. It's not like completely throwing everything out the window and chucking 20 inches on because now you're old and you're a slow twitch person, So I think that's quite important to keep the perspective of that as well. And with that in mind, guys, it's like, so with if you were to take, it's very hard to know what gear everyone's on. That's a sentence in itself, isn't it? But in terms of what gear people are riding at elite level, so if you're to take, let's say, the top 20 at the Elite World Championships, men and women, of course, what kind of gears do you think people would be riding? What kind of range would they be on from biggest to smallest?
I think it would be a fair range. I'd say between 115 up to 140. It's quite a big range. For me, it's and I'm sure a lot of the pro guys, you can go similar peak speeds on anywhere in that range, really, and it's more a case of how you get there. So if you're on a quick track like Paris, maybe you can gear up a little bit because you got a bigger banking to get there. But I'd say majority of people will be on between those gears, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's probably a bit of a normal distribution between those. The average probably works out somewhere around 124, 126, something like that.
Yeah.
And there's a few outliers either side of that. But I think there's an interesting point about the peak speed, because I think as well with the top guys, you could take 10 inches off or put 10 inches on their quali gear. They'd probably qualify within a tenth and a half. Whereas I think when you look at a lot of amateur guys, they get really fixated on, this is my race gear. If it's 2 inches higher or lower, I can't perform.
That ties back into, as a lead guy, we need to be strong. We need to be quick across a range of cadences because all our events go through that range of cadences. But that probably ties into why we can qualify similarly on gears that are 15 inches either side are optimum.
How often do you reckon that you would say that person's on too small a gear or too big a gear at elite level compared to amateur level?
Tricky to say, because you could be on a small gear that you come into the jump of the 200 slow, and then that gear's okay, or you could come in absolute red hot into the jump, and then the same gear is too big. So I think it really depends on how you ride it. But I guess all the elite guys, you're gonna look okay on a range of gears. So it's probably gonna be hard to say that gear's too big or too small. So you more often see people that look like they're on a gear too big. But again, that might be because they've messed up their entry speed and they're just coming in too slow. It's difficult to say, really.
And for all you know as well, even if the gear looks really big, they might have tested a range of gears, and that's how they deliver a performance in a 200. I think most of the elite guys are pretty dialed into the 200 build-up.
I think one thing I quite like as a little breakdown of whether a gear is too big is, ideally you're, on every gear, small or big, your pedaling technique is pretty similar. So I think if you're on 100-inch gear or 150-inch gear, you're literally just watching it 1.5 times. So there's no noticeable, visible breakdown in how you pedal. So if you look at riders, and again, we obviously don't see this at the elite level, but at amateur level, it's very, very common that they're kind of wrestling the bike and really choppy with their pedaling, and their cores have gone to pot, and the gear obviously feels big. And like some people kind of like the sensation, you got something really strong to push against. But that's when I look at that and think, well, that's not how you ride a smaller gear. So why have you changed your pedaling? That's probably a breakdown basically, and the gear's too big.
I mean, and a very other obvious way of looking is you're lucky enough to have a speed sensor. You're hitting that peak the second you go over the 200-meter line, but that's a pretty sure sign that you're getting everything out of that gear and you're hitting peak at the moment you want to. If it's taking you an extra quarter of a lap and you're not hitting peak until you're coming out of turn 2, that's maybe a sign that the gear's too big and it's taking you too long to accelerate to that point. I think that's also another easy way to see.
I really like the training concept that you should be able to get the fastest time you're capable of doing on every single gear. So if I said to you, do a flying 200 on 90 or 110 or 130 or 150, you can say that was the fastest I was capable of on that gear. I think that keeps you really versatile and able to deal with that, because much like we said with outdoor racing, having to change gear, and people can be very sensitive to gear changes and overthink it. And I think when it comes to execution of a flying 200 on race day, when you're filled with adrenaline, the first few laps always feel easier. Your legs feel like they're not even touching the pedals, and we do see that a lot with all athletes, that they kind of, the adrenaline takes over and they mess up their flying 200, if you like. I think having that versatility to be able to execute on all the gears just keeps you really in tune with how to ride a flying 200. It's something I've done in the past is get riders to do a session where they do a flying 100 on 100, one on 120 or similar, and one on 130, for example. So one that's too small, one that might be about right, and one that's too big. To change that thing of getting off, how many times have we heard this? They get off from their flying 200 and they say, oh, the gear was too big. Oh, I felt like I was spinning out. And actually you weren't. You've got a boss, the cadences might have changed 1 or 2 from in training. Like you're not spinning out and you're not on a gear that's too big.
And if you spent the whole month only using tiny gears, probably go to a medium gear and it'd feel too big, just because that's what I've been doing small gears recently. But it doesn't mean it's too big for what you're trying to achieve. Just relative feeling to what you've been doing.
Yeah. But how often, I mean, you guys must have heard this as well from riders, and it's quite interesting, where someone comes, they do their flying effort, either hit out or at a race, and they say, I was on the wrong gear. Like, how common is that?
And you wouldn't say that if your time was a PB. It's probably...
No, but equally, how many times have you guys felt that racing at any level at Paralympics, World Championships, where you get off your flying 200 and you're like, that was the wrong gear? You're so well, I mean, I presume never, because you're so well drilled at that point. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but you're so well drilled at that point that you're completely comfortable with what you're doing. Even if the legs feel bad, you don't think, I was on the wrong gear.
I've never felt that indoors. I felt it outdoors a lot, and I think that comes back to the normalizing cadence rather than gear. Like, I think maybe if I race in Dudenhofen somewhere in Germany outdoors, and I'm racing on the gear that I would usually qualify indoors on, then I'll almost certainly come off thinking that's too big. But yeah, in terms of indoor controllable condition racing, I don't think I'm off thinking.
No,
Which is interesting.
not for a long time.
Because it's very common. Like, it's very, very common. How, Eamon, if you were to kind of briefly explain how you would train to, generally, I was going to say to find your fastest gear, but let's just generally, right, because all training is geared towards the fastest gear. Like, how do you approach within a training week or a training phase what kind of gear to choose? Like, in terms of big gears, little gears, a bit of both. What would you?
I think, and we've already touched on it. Like the rider feedback is really important, and also, kind of, if you're lucky enough to have cadence and power and speed, and kind of looking at the bigger picture, but also, being aware that, as you say, you could be in a different training phase, right? And that if you're on a smaller gear now and you've moved up to a medium-sized gear, that they're just sensations sometimes. And so if you are working through all those different cadence ranges, that you are more suited or better equipped to be able to give that self-analysis. Whereas if you only ever ride, the same gear, and then race day you throw on a race gear, and it may feel bigger because you haven't given that gear a chance at any other stage. So I think it's just working through the ranges, being a little bit self-aware, and the way to do that is just by practicing and being in those gears and not changing it on race day.
Classic.
Unless it's windy.
Then
shouldn't
change
be.
it. And it depends which way the wind's blowing.
Yeah,
Sure, I think it's a trial and error, isn't it? You've got
it's trial and error.
You've got to put repetition into different gears on the same effort, really, trying to change one variable in terms of a gear, and see how that affects your overall speed, firstly, and how that translates into overall time. I think it's just getting out there on the track and giving it a chance, giving smaller gears a chance, giving bigger gears a chance, working below and above what you think your optimum gear is when you're away from a race, not at a race. Just to give yourself information to build towards the case of what your best gear is.
There's so much data you can look at, and I think it's easy to get lost in it. But I think ultimately the metric that it always comes back to is time. Ultimately, that's what holds you to account on race day. And I think it is easy to lose sight of it. But I think the gear that you're producing the fastest times on, the gear you've got to ride.
Yeah. I think from a training point of view, right, as well, spending time pedaling faster than your race cadence and pedaling slower is like a really good principle, because then it'll allow you to find your true fastest gear instead of engineering it. So, again, one thing I feel I've seen a lot is I want to ride 100 massive gear. So therefore I'll kind of set all my training on massive gears so that I force myself, and it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but ignoring kind of speed work, high cadence work, because you want to be the big gear rider. Whereas I think as long as you're doing both, then you'll kind of naturally get to your own sweet spot in time, and the stimulus hits both ends of the pedaling spectrum.
I think you see guys, like you say, who want to be the big gear guy. They'll do all their training on 140. And then if they did test a range of gears to find the fastest flying two, probably would be somewhere in the 130s, because they've completely neglected the small gear work. And where their fastest gear might be 130 and they can do an 11.6, if they'd done a more well-rounded training program, fastest gear might be 120, but it'd be an 11.2. So I think you can sort of train being a big gear rider into existence, but it might not always be the best thing to do.
Yeah.
Here's a point.
Sorry, go on.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Here's one for you, which is a bit of a surprise, and I don't know the answer to. How would you choose, other than just gut feel, how do you choose what gear you match sprint on? Because you can get very scientific about 200 and cadence ranges and all of these things. And if I'm honest, and this may well be the answer we all agree on, but you just kind of put your finger up in the air and think, yeah, it feels like a 115 day, and actually it's quite hard to be scientific about it and justify that. What do you think?
I think there's a trade-off when you're selecting gears between obviously acceleration and peak speed. You're going into a 200, it's solely focused on peak speed, whereas a match sprint's a lot more of a
holistic event.
Uncontrolled holistic event. It's a lot more uncontrolled environment. Obviously, there's another rider on track. They can do whatever they want. So obviously, you need to bring acceleration into the equation a bit more. And I think you've just got to know what peak speed you can produce on what gear, the acceleration to match it, and then sort of take the rider you're racing into account as well. If they're really punchy, like say for example, they're a P1 in the team sprint, they've got a lot of acceleration, they're likely to leave it to go to a bit of a jump. You probably gear down a little bit to something that you're confident in your excel as well. if they're a kilo rider, you think they're almost definitely going to want to draw this out long. You put a bit of a bigger gear on to shift the compromise more towards the peak speed side of things.
So you would, and just to confirm on that, because it's I don't know, controversial, but you'd gear against your opponent as opposed to gearing to your own strengths.
I'd take it into account for sure, yeah. But that would be a small shift. That might be choosing between 114 and 116. There's certainly no seismic shifts in gear based on who you're racing.
Yeah, I think I've got like a figure in my head, or a gear in my head, which I know I can kind of deliver a good, like a sub 10 200 in a sprint, for example, and I work around that gear essentially. If I'm racing someone with better peak speed than me, maybe I'll gear that up a little bit and make sure I come in hotter into that 200. If it's someone I think can out jump me, maybe I'll gear down just 2 inches just to give myself that option to react to them. But I think it always goes around, for myself anyway, I always go in with what gear I can deliver a really good 200 on, with one eye maybe on potential pitfalls that the opponent might take to me.
Joe's articulated what I was trying to say quite a lot better there.
I think it's difficult to know, especially early in the rounds. Like if you've done a load of small gear training and it's like early in the round, first sprint of the day, might be a little bit hesitant with which gear to choose. I think if you put on a gear which you're confident you can deliver a strong 200 with, no matter what the occasion happens in the race, it'll leave you in a fairly good place.
And sort of when push comes to shove as well, these small changes in gear are going to have a pretty minimal effect on your top speed and your acceleration. We're talking like a shift of 1 or 2 inches. I think people really get caught up on that sometimes. Once the gear's on the bike, you've just got to forget about it, get on track and execute. I think, especially when you get riders who lose a race, they come off, the first thing they say is the gear was too big, the gear was too small. They've been thinking about that way too much. You've got to get the gear on the bike and execute a winning race.
Yeah, and it comes back to what I was saying about needs to be strong across a range of cadences. If you can qualify well on 130, then you should be able to deliver a good 200 on 110 as well. And that just comes down to your preparation into the event.
Yeah. Here's one for you. Potential controversial. I reckon it's not really that controversial. Controversial question. So if you're fortunate enough to qualify right at the top end, do you gear up through the rounds? So if you're racing a slower opponent early on, who's, say, for example, half a second slower, so you're confident you can beat them, would you gear down and then gear up throughout the day as the racing gets faster, or would you stick your match sprint gear on for every single round? I know different people do different things, so I'm just interested to get your guys' thoughts on it.
Again, I wouldn't think too far ahead of first round that's ahead of you. I'd just take it one at, like you said, you look at who could be in your drill for the day, but I would never focus any more than literally the one race I've got. Even if I've qualified first, I'm against 32nd place. Like, I would, just focus on what it takes to win that one race first.
But would you gear down? So say your optimal match sprint gear is 117, but you've got a second in hand in the first round. It's a really common thing we see.
I mean, yeah, I would
save the legs on a lighter gear is what people say.
Not because it saves the legs, but because it gives you more options in the race. So if you're racing someone that's 2 seconds slower than you, there's a pretty big chance they're going to try and jump you at the start, or they're going to try and do something wacky to try and throw you off. So if you're on a gear that you can react to very easily, then that would make sense to gear down. But I don't think gearing down to save the legs is something I'd consider. Not for the sake of saving legs. I'll do it for the sake of giving myself more options against an opposition who probably is going to take risks and try different things. When I'm racing someone that's similar speed to me, then you know that they don't need to take silly risk at the start or do things that you haven't thought of. So you're more able to go on a gear that best matches what your best flying 200 would be, or your best deliverance, your best 200 delivery in that last lap. But early in the day, you may want to just, keep your options open in a race with a smaller gear. But again, it wouldn't be for the sake of saving my legs, because I'm not even sure a smaller gear would.
No, well, this is my point. So I only say that because it's really common. This is a really, really common thing that exists, is saving your legs on a lighter gear. And from that point of view, I would always say, well, if I go on the gear, like my kind of optimal gear, then that's saving my legs, right? Because it's a nice comfy cadence range that I enjoy and can put power down well. But I hadn't actually thought of it, to be fair, of Well, if you're racing someone a second slower than you, the only way they can beat you is by going really hard, really early. They're never going to beat you by doing a fast last 200 because they haven't got that within them.
Yeah.
So it actually comes to the same point for a completely different reason.
Well, if you look at fatigue as the amount of contractions, then smaller gears could be more fatiguing. Depends on the way you look at fatigue, which would go against the point of gearing down for your legs. Yeah, again, I just take every round as it comes, to be honest. And I think even early in the day, you've seen examples where people have been beaten early in the day by a much slower position, and it's usually down to like a tactical error or some unexpected move from the slower guy. And I think by gearing down, you cover yourself for that, but not so much to the point that you leave yourself exposed to what your strength is over them, which is your speed. So again, you're just taking ride at a time.
Yeah. One, possibly the final point, which I think is a really interesting one, is one massive difference between, I guess, UCI level racing and amateur racing, is the question of how important is your flying 200? Because I've no doubt for you guys, you're like crucial.
Huge, yeah.
Because it gets you through the day in the easiest way possible.
Yeah.
You know, so if you qualify 5th or 8th, you got the difference of the quarterfinal of being against someone basically the same as you or much, much faster. So it's crucial, absolutely crucial, right? But when we get to amateur racing, pretty much without exception, the depth isn't there. So I always find it really interesting. Looking at World Masters as a great example, that all the focus in preparation and training is on your flying 200, right? Because that's a number. It's nice to have a number, and obviously I get that. It's recognition that you improved. It's a time.
Like tangible.
It's tangible, but you probably will get the top 8 guys. And just because of the numbers, there's probably going to be 7 or 8 tenths between them. And generally, not always, generally, the 200 meters doesn't make as big a difference as it does when, a UCI level where a tenth or 2 tenths could mean 10 more places. So I think, obviously I can't give that as golden advice because there'll always be someone who just misses out on what they want by 100th. But I do think that amateurs train for the flying 200 almost exclusively and forget that actually all it does is set you up for a day of racing. So equally with that in mind, it's just about like all that's really important is where you qualify as opposed to the time you do when it comes to it. So it's just something that I'm really big on is train for the match sprint, is not just training for flying 200.
If you can race a match sprint well, then you can do a 200 well if you look at it that way. There's a lot of people that can do 200s very well, but they struggle in the sprints. If you look at the people that race well in the sprints, they're more than likely to be able to do a good 200. So one doesn't necessarily lead to the other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think when the draws are really tight, if you can get yourself a bit higher up the draw, it's obviously going to help you. But in the amateur racing and the masters racing tomorrow, where the draws are a bit more spaced out, it's just worth remembering that there's no stripes given out for flying 200 world champion. You've got to be able to finish off the day of racing as well.
I think it's probably a product of not as much amateur racing available to people sometimes. And so they can go from one end of the year to the other without having the opportunity to race. So their carrot is the 200 and they can measure that through the year. And then it's probably quite easy to get fixated on that and forget that you have to race after it. Some people are actually really happy to just do the 200 and almost the pressure is off then afterwards and they don't really care about the races, which is wrong, obviously, or you wouldn't want to be there. But yeah, I think sometimes it's a lack of opportunity through the year to race and almost putting it to the back of your mind, and obviously not having training groups where you can even bounce off your teammates and get the opportunity to practice racing. So I think that's sometimes part of it. It's why there's such a fixation on the 200.
Yeah, and even like the psychological impact of that. So you could have 2 riders, right? One goes 10.7 and there's a huge PB, and they'll go through the rest of the day feeling like they're invincible. And you have another rider who's gone 10.7, which is 2 tenths slower than they wanted. And they're like, I've got bad legs. You got 2 guys. One's riding on cloud 9, feels like he can't be beaten, and the other's going terribly because he'd gone 2 tenths slower than he wanted. And that the psychology of the flying 200 can carry through the entire race day and impact how the decisions you make. So I think it's again so important to draw a line under the 200 and move on to racing. Just knowing that all you've got to do is beat the other person. Actually that 200 has served its purpose. It's done the seeding. Now move on.
It's always a badge of honour to end a sprint day finishing higher than you qualified. I think that's always no matter where you have qualified, you could have had a shocker and you're down, in the 11th, for example, or you could have qualified well in the top 4. As long as your finishing position is above where your qualifying position, I think you've pretty much done what you can with the legs you've got that day. I think that's always, for me, that's like a target I've taken into any 200s I've done. Straight after that, right, where have I qualified? How can I finish higher than that by the end of the day? And that just comes with your sprinting.
I think it's something the elite guys are often a bit better at, is drawing a line under the 200 and focusing on the racing. I think it comes from more racing opportunities, like Eamon said. You get experience. We all have good days and bad days in qualifying, but ultimately you've got to find a way to grind out the best results, and dwelling on the 200 doesn't help you do that.
Absolutely.
It's much easier to go fast from the top of the track. Obviously, you've got the use of gravity. Whereas in sprinting, everything can be from the black line. If you really want to draw it down to the black, it can be fully on the black line. And I think that is much harder to get to than being quick off the top. And I think very often, even if you don't qualify well, if you're quick from the black line, that carries you through racing so well, in amateur especially. And I think maybe that's a point where a lot of people should focus more of their attention on their speed from the blue line and below. So if you can be quick from there, you can also be quick from the top. But if you're quick from the top, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be quick from the bottom.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is the end of the episode on the Blackline Coaching Podcast. If you'd like to hear more episodes, you can click here. Or if you'd like to learn more about Blackline Coaching, you can check us out on our website. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you soon.